My father catalogued plants. That was his work. Colonial survey botanist for the Resettlement Authority. 8 months on Vethrani, measuring root depth and soil alkalinity on a plateau the Vethrani garrison considered too exposed to be worth holding. He brought me because my mother had died 2 years before, and he had nobody to leave me with, and because he believed children should see things. I was 12. I brought Drum. Drum was a St. Bernard. He was 6 years old and weighed 61 kilograms, and had never once been hurried in his life. His coat was the color of old copper and cream. His head was the size of a cooking pot, and when he sat down beside you, he would lean his full weight into your leg without asking permission. He was, according to the Vethrani manifest officer at the dock, a Class Nil biological accompaniment, non-essential, requiring no special handling or quarantine protocol. She typed it in with 2 fingers and did not look up. Vethrani had a sky the color of pewter and a plateau that went flat in every direction until it dropped away into ravines you couldn't see the bottom of. The garrison was 6 Vethrani survey officers and a rotating complement of what they called enforcement observers, 3 of them, armored, who kept to the eastern prefab and watched us when they thought we weren't watching back. The garrison commander was a senior officer named HFY. He had a long jaw and the posture of someone who expected apologies. He met us on arrival, looked at my father's equipment cases, looked at me, looked at Drum, and said something in Vethrani that the translation unit rendered as, "The child and the animal will not impede the survey schedule." My father said, "Of course not." He said it the way he said everything, which was quietly and without putting any particular weight on it. The first week was unremarkable. My father planted sensor stakes and took soil samples and recorded his findings in a field notebook. I helped carry the smaller cases. Drum walked with us, or lay in the shade of the equipment shelter, or sat with his chin on my knee while I read. The Vethrani observers logged him twice in their daily reports, both times under the same category, Class Nil accompaniment, stationary, no threat assessment required. I know this because my father obtained copies of the daily reports through the Joint Survey Disclosure Agreement, and I read them later. I still have them. The situation with HFY's junior officer began on day 11. His name, in the translation unit's phonetic rendering, was Vethrani. He was younger than HFY and had a habit of arriving in places before he was expected. He arrived at the equipment shelter one afternoon, while my father was at the far sensor line, 2 kilometers north. I was sitting on an equipment case eating a ration bar. Drum was beside me, lying down, head on his paws. Vethrani stood at the shelter entrance and looked at me for a time without speaking. Then he spoke. The translation unit, which I wore on a lanyard, rendered it as, "The child will come with me to the garrison building. There is a question of inventory that requires the observer's authorization. Your father cannot be reached on the communication frequency." I said, "I'm not authorized to sign anything. My father is the observer of record." He said, "This is not a request." Drum lifted his head. He did it slowly, the way he always did everything, the way you'd lift a weight you weren't in a hurry to set down. His chin came off his paws, and his head came up, and he looked at Vethrani. He didn't stand. He didn't make a sound. He was lying on the ground between me and the shelter entrance, and he looked at the Vethrani officer, and his tail moved once, a slow sweep, and then it stopped. Vethrani looked at Drum. I watched Vethrani look at Drum. I had seen that look before, or something close to it. My father's colleague at the Survey Authority had a cat, a large gray tom, and once, when a maintenance worker pushed the door open too fast, the cat had simply turned its head and looked at the man, and the maintenance worker had stopped, stepped back, and apologized to the cat. He had not understood why he was apologizing. He had apologized anyway. Vethrani understood less than that. He stood at the entrance of the shelter and looked at Drum for 4 seconds, and I counted them, and on the 4th second, he took 1 step backward. He said, in Vethrani, "What is that?" The translation unit said, "What is that?" I said, "That's Drum. He's friendly." I said it the way my father said things, without putting any particular weight on it. Drum looked at Lethdevar. Lethdevar looked at Drum. The plateau wind moved across the shelter entrance and pushed a little red dust along the ground, and Drum's ears moved slightly in it, tracking the sound, and then settled again. Lethdevar left. He walked back across the plateau toward the garrison building. He did not run. He walked steadily, and he did not look back, and he went inside, and the door closed, and I did not see him outside again for the remaining 6 weeks of the survey. My father returned from the sensor line 2 hours later. I told him what had happened. He listened, wrote a note in his field book, and said, "Thank you for telling me." Then he gave Drum a piece of jerky from his jacket pocket, and Drum ate it without any particular gratitude or excitement, which was characteristic. Threshkavar came to our shelter on day 14. He was alone, which was unusual, and he stood outside the entrance rather than coming in, which was also unusual. He asked my father several questions about the survey timeline. My father answered them. Then Threshkavar looked at Drum, who was asleep on the equipment mat, and asked, in very slow and careful translation unit Vethrani, what species the animal was. My father told him. Threshkavar asked how large the adult members of the species became. My father said, "Drum is full grown." Threshkavar stood there for a moment. Then he asked a question the translation unit rendered as, "Are there many of them on Earth?" My father said, "A fair number. They're popular with families." Threshkavar nodded once, the Vethrani gesture that the translation unit flagged as provisional acknowledgement, and walked back to the garrison building. The formal request for garrison rotation arrived through the Joint Survey Administrative Channel on day 19. It was addressed to Vethrani Survey Authority Central, copied to the Resettlement Authority Liaison Office, and it cited operational environmental factors as the grounds for reassignment. It was 2 pages, standard Vethrani administrative format. At the bottom of the second page, in the section reserved for additional notes, Threshkavar had written 4 words in Vethrani, which the translation unit rendered as, "the earth animal," specifically. My father read it, made a note in his field book, and said nothing. I read it after him. I read it 3 times. The garrison rotated on day 26. The new crew arrived with a different manifest officer, who asked about Drum twice, wrote companion animal, survey accompaniment in the category field, and put a small star beside it in the margin, unprompted. I don't know what the star was for. I didn't ask. We finished the survey on day 52. The soil data was submitted. The sensor stakes were pulled. The equipment cases were sealed and loaded onto the shuttle, and Drum walked up the loading ramp without being asked, turned around at the top, and sat down with his back to the shuttle interior, and looked out at the plateau for a moment, before my father said, "All right, come on," and Drum stood up, and walked into the shuttle and the ramp closed. The Veth Karal Plateau survey file was classified as complete and archived. The environmental category notation was amended 6 months later by the Resettlement Authority's Central Records Office. I know this because my father obtained a copy of the amendment through the disclosure agreement, and he showed it to me, and I read the new notation, and I asked him what it meant. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "It means they adjusted their records to account for something they hadn't thought to measure before." I asked, "What did they change it to?" He showed me the field. The original notation read, Class Nil biological accompaniment. The amended notation read, Survey accompanied earth fauna, classification pending further review. Drum was asleep on the floor of the records office while we read this. He was on his side, legs extended, taking up a significant portion of the floor. 3 survey authority clerks had already stepped around him twice without comment, and one of them had, without breaking stride or making eye contact with anyone, reached down and scratched him briefly behind the ear as she passed, and Drum had exhaled through his nose and not woken up. The classification has been pending further review for 11 years now. I don't think they're going to resolve it.